Uh, it's very interesting because I think for me, my identity as a feminist developed as I was doing transnational activism. So they both my identity as a transnational feminist and as a feminist go hand in hand. Um, I think the moment I got involved in feminism was right after the World Conference on Women. Yeah, it happened randomly, and it again. So my identity as working full time as an activist started with that idea of transnationalism. I think as it was starting to be clear that our ways of organizing were going to be more effective if we worked as an international movement of feminists.
Mhm.
So I was lucky to start at that point.
Mhm. Well, one.
So I now, as a 20 years into this or more into this work, um, I I think where I relate as a woman of the South located in the North is that I see myself as a linchpin of many identities, and I'm able to work with women in the South and help them to see how they can be part of the efforts that are global and vice versa. Um,
Mhm.
but it is true that sometimes the global movement needs to choose 3 representatives to talk to the General Assembly. And at those points, representation is the key decision that needs to be made on the fly. So you have 200 women in a room, and we have to choose 3 women to talk about human rights. And how are those decisions made is very interesting. And I think over time, my ability to plug in with all these different players has allowed me to help make those decisions in a more consultative way, where the women that choose to agree to be that representation don't feel uncomfortable about it, because it's not so much an exploitation of that representation, but an inclusion and a use for it politically for the larger movement. And I think that's where, over the years, my identity that shifts back and forth has allowed me to work around those issues, which are difficult. But it's true that sometimes 2 minutes for 2 women representing world human rights.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I thought Miss Universe had a problem. 1 minute.
And Miss Universe, yes, yes. And, global peace and love. Yes,
It's
but that's
exactly
really
like.
how the UN processes work sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah. And nowadays, even with gender identity, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, when we went to for me, the biggest learning for me on transnational feminism really was the World Conference Against Racism, which was the one conference where the feminists had difficult difficulties agreeing on what representation meant.
Wow.
Other than that, as women, we can choose that identity, but there was so many identities attached that it was competing identities, and that for me was, I think, the biggest lesson, that conference, because it was, who was it, an indigenous woman, was it a Palestinian woman at that particular time that I had to speak, and then all these different politics became so then women set up all these sub caucuses. There was more division than I had ever seen. And for me, it was very important because there's representation, and there's that point where you feel exploited by representation, and that creates conflict. And I think that's when I learned the importance of talking it through before you assume that somebody wants to be and accept that representation.
Yeah.
That made me think of actually another example, which for me was brilliant, is that, so I'm married to an Australian, so I'm an Australian. So once I went to a conference and I said I cannot, because I wanted to shift it. I told them I can speak as an Australian woman,
Mhm.
and that didn't go very well. But I said I have the citizenship,
Yeah.
and I have lived there, and here's my passport, so what makes you think that I can't? So that
Yeah.
was a very interesting debate we entered once. But
Wow.
It's
Who was, I'm just curious, who was objecting? Actual Australians?
sorry?
Who was objecting?
Well, it was yeah, a group of Australian women working on violence against women. And they were talking about migrant women, and I didn't think they didn't include migrant women because, again, coming overseas, you don't always get the, there's all these different situations. And I said, well, then then the representation discussion started. And then I said, well, then I am an immigrant, and what if I have a different perspective, because I thought it was being a bit exclusionary, and it created a big debate.
Wow.
They kept on saying, you're not Australian, and it was a very interesting, I mean, the feminist movement, sometimes we get into this, and I don't mind. I mean, it's not about shying away from conflict when it's needed, because I think conflict leads to reflection. And again, talking it through is very important, because I think sometimes it's not that, sometimes it's the pressure of being in an international forum that causes people to make very quick decisions that are really problematic.
Yeah.
Again, it's the transnational thing. So I have this little girls, and I couldn't find a daycare that kind of didn't, that captured that complex identity that they have. They're Venezuelan, they're Egyptian, they're they're New Yorkers, they're Coptic, they're Australian, and I wanted them to learn Spanish, because I also find that in a dominant culture, if you don't become bicultural from the beginning, it's a choice that's made for you. Whereas I think biculturalism from an early age is a choice you can make over time, and then you can figure it out, all these identities. So I created a preschool and found that all the teachers that I was finding were all migrant women, most of the time survivors of violence, and that saw themselves as women of the South, although they're here in the North for a very long time. Some are new arrivals. So that ability to work with them as teachers, but to get the parents, which, and many times, and the moms, to work with them as women of the North, and work in a more equal way, because it's these women of the South that are teaching Spanish to their children, and these mothers want that to happen, has been a really excellent feminist exercise for me. And it's been, I mean, my first experience in social enterprise. But I think because we assume, the caring, this also accepted identity that many women have, especially when they migrate, to be the carers, to be the nannies, to be the babysitters. And for women to accept that this women taking care of the children are going to be migrant women has been a very interesting thing for me. And then creating that into a school that's now well respected, that competes with other preschools. It's not like a nursery school. We're a preschool, we're progressive, we teach human rights. I do training with the teachers on feminist issues, because again I learned that a lot of them migrated escaping violence. And we got to the point where we were reading The Paperback Princess. I don't know if you know this story. It's about a princess that decides to burn her dress. Yeah. And we had a 2-day debate on whether or not it was appropriate for the children to have a feminist book.
She gets her pick of goth dress later.
And I was able to convince them. But that's been very interesting for me, how they view me, these teachers, as a way to cross over culturally. And they've told me that. They said it's good to have a translator on what's appropriate, what's, how to engage with parents, so that they see me as a professional, not only as a carer, like a low paid care worker. And I say, you may not speak English, but that doesn't mean you're less qualified. You still have the qualifications, and most of them are trained in their countries. So that exercise for me has been fascinating, and how I've been able to talk about it without really making a big deal about the fact that these are migrant, teachers, and their experiences with the parents. but even like the children also come from very complex, you know, a New York back, you know, I imagine it's the same in Canada. They come from many times bicultural families, but and people were telling me that in their experience raising children, you know, they refuse to speak the language, and this hasn't happened. Like, they're very proud of it. They're very proud of their secret language, as they call it. You know, in the playground, they're like, "Oh,
That's
we're
one
the
way
kids
to
speak
call
Spanish."
it.
But for me, it's been, you know, it's all this lesson as you know, I also call it, and something I wanted to put through. I mean, learning a lot about this multiculturalism, bicultural. There's something that's called in a lot of research now bilingual aesthetics, which is when you speak a different language, sometimes even your whole idea of what's beautiful, what's correct changes. And I think that's what happens with transnational feminism. You know, I think I also have this translator in my head. And it's the same
Yes.
feminist ideas, and it's the same feminist goals, but a lot of how strategy works in different environments, it's something I'm very aware of. So it's almost maybe a feminist aesthetics, feminist bicultural aesthetic. Yeah, no, that's sorry. It's just like I have so many projects at the moment. I'm like, so I'm also part. So this is interesting, and that was another part of where I had to use my. So this is the network on it's called the National Network on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Initiative. NESRI, no, economic and social rights. Yeah, here nobody likes cultural rights, so they drop it. So it's an American, you know, national level. And for many years, so I've been here 8 years, I didn't really do a lot of national work. But over time, I started realizing that there was no separation. There was no, and as I did that, I started being approached by more interesting projects, and I started, and especially, of course, you can imagine now with Trump even more, like I see the relevance of being involved. And so I got invited to be part of this organization, NESRI. And one of the most interesting projects that I've been working with them, it's with farm workers, you know, working in Florida in some farms. And so they're fruit pickers, and it's called the Fair Work Campaign. And generally in the fields, rape of migrant women is like it's almost like new forms of slavery, like rape on the field. There's so much that there's been research about it. It happens everywhere. But in this initiative where the workers organized and they got the big companies to give the farms a stamp saying it's a fair food campaign, the way the food is picked, the way it's packed, the way it's distributed has to be with human rights standards. And if there's a complaint by a worker, there's a whole mediation process and restitution process that happens with the people, that even the farm owners and the workers. So if they take the seal away from the farm won't be able to sell to very major supermarkets. So it's changed the game. It's changed the game, and it's changed the way women see sexual harassment in the workplace, in the farms. So it's, to me, it's actually tomorrow I'm going to a meeting about it, because it's the fact that sexual harassment has been reduced so quickly. It's been amazing, because they even have a hotline for the workers where other workers pick up the complaints. And again, the idea that you're illegal and you're going to be deported, and you know, I mean, there were even some farms when this started where they found people were shackled and you know, really slave-like conditions. I mean, I didn't know this was possible and that this was happening in Florida and in California, but it is to that point, you know, of exploitation that, you know, I mean, we think of trafficking, of all the things we know about, but I had no idea a farm in the US could still have modern forms of slavery, and nobody ever, you know, there's not a lot of oversight. There's not a lot of oversight. And that they were able to pick up on that, organize, and that the women, I think also the framing, because it's economic and social rights that I find very interesting, is that it's women and their families, and it's men and their families. So the idea of them working together, I mean, sometimes it was the whole family seeing, you know, what was happening to their mom, you know, so there was all these issues. And in terms of quality of life, the things that the workers, why they're now feel better. It's things like they used to get picked up at 4 a.m. and the kids had a very low performance at school, because you had to drop them off in a trailer at 4 a.m., like a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, not have breakfast. And by the time they got to school, they weren't studying. They didn't see the value. They were, hungry. So by changing the start of the workday, again, as a collective strategy where the women thought of the children and the women being able to drop off the kids at school, they've also found that the kids are performing better.
Wow.
And the dads are now doing more drop off and pick up and, the feeding as well. So it's been a very interesting, kind of, to me, it shows that when you really work with a collective human rights strategy as well with your feminism, it really, everybody understands that it's beneficial for everybody, that it's a whole network of relationships that we have, and this, of course, this is in the whole idea of women that are, that migrate with their children and everything. But I mean, for me, it's been a wonderful experience just to, I do more of where I'm working with this, and maybe you're interested as well, is that I'm doing trying to figure out, everybody told me that we would never be able to find funding for this, right? To kind of support this. And of course, the corporations give it, but I'm trying to work with individual donors in the idea of political philanthropy. So I'm trying to train and work with high-level philanthropists who are kind of the loners and the radicals at that space, because I find that political work is only funded nowadays by individuals. If you go for a state agency, there's a lot of work you won't be able to do with a grant by a government agency on issues like this. I think it's this is what I've learned over time, is that I think to have a common ideology is so important. But I think what I've learned more and more, like the relationships that stick in the women's movement and the partnerships, even, it's also when you have compassion. I mean, we make mistakes over the many decades we've known each other. We've made political mistakes.
Yes.
And so it's important to also see that alliances change, that it's important to forgive the sisters. The sisters will make mistakes.
Talk to each other.
That you talk to each other. And I think that part of really compassion and openness and ability to, even people you would have thought I was never going to work with them 15 years ago. Sometimes I found this a lot with women and transnational ideologies that are feminist. Things change a lot over decades. I mean, issues that didn't affect women of the North 20 years ago when we were talking about it, or like the right to water, was something that I talked about, and people in Southeast Asia talked about, and nobody really cared. And now, for example, with the situation here in the States with the lead in Detroit, it's an issue that it's now important for transnational feminism. So I think, it's just that openness to recognize that what really matters is the commitment to women's issues, but the way we frame it, we have to be very compassionate and patient, because it doesn't always happen. We don't always get it right away.
Yep. Yeah. So thank you very much, Maria.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad the connection got better. I'm sorry at the beginning.